Hi, everybody, and thanks for joining our weekly podcast. I'm Shelley Kohan, and very excited to have back on Retail Unwrapped Jonathan Gold, who's the Vice President of Supply Chain and Customs Policy at the National Retail Federation. And as most of our listeners are aware, the NRF is the voice of retail and really an advocate for retail on trade, government policies, regulations, and you're located right in DC, which is a prime spot to help all of us with those things. So, John, I am thrilled to have you back. Welcome.
Hi, Shelley. Hi, Shelley. Good to talk to you. Happy to be back again.
Well, we have a hot topic today. We're going to be talking about tariffs and the impacts on both retailers and consumers. And we have to bring up the demise, or I guess short delay demise. It's back again of de minimis and what that means to consumers and importers to the U.S. So we're going to jump right in. And when I think about tariffs and I think about, retailers and consumers, it's really hard to separate the two big components. One is, tariffs obviously raise the cost of goods, which eventually means higher prices for retailers or less profit. Higher prices for consumers or less profit for retailers, or kind of a mix of both, right? So retailers either making less money or charging the customer more. And second, tariffs might actually have an impact on the range of products that can be produced because importation makes them unprofitable. So talk to us, John, about these domino effects and what's happening and what retailers should be thinking about.
Thanks, Shelley. Tariffs are certainly front and center for a lot of people. Have been discussed for months now. I mean, throughout the campaign, post-election, we've had a number of announcements post-inauguration as well. So, I think first and foremost, we need to kind of level set here in the fact that, tariffs are a tax that are paid by the U.S. importer. They're not paid by the foreign country. They're not paid by the foreign supplier. So I think, when we talk about tariffs, we're talking about the fact that it's the U.S. importer, either the retailer or their supplier, their U.S. supplier, who's paying that tax and then passing it along through the chain, ultimately to the end consumer. So, unfortunately, consumers probably will see higher prices as a result of tariffs. I think right now retailers are trying to figure their way through the multitude of tariff announcements, trying to figure out how, when, and where the tariffs will impact them, what their ability is to mitigate the impact of the tariffs, to lessen the impact on consumers. But as you noted, they will hit the bottom line at some point throughout the cycle here. So again, trying to figure out what is their best avenue to minimize the impact, not just to the company, but to the ultimate consumer as well. And, as you noted, we've seen a multitude of announcements on tariffs since day one. There was a lot of concern going into the inauguration that we were going to see the universal baseline tariffs that President Trump talked about. That was the additional 10 to 20% tariffs on everything and everyone. There was talk of an additional 60 to 100% tariffs on China as well. We did a study that came out the day before the election, actually, that looked at 6 key retail categories. I think we talked about this the last time we talked, and showed that just within those 6 categories alone, consumers would lose between $46 and $78 billion worth of spending power because prices were going to have to increase. And again, many companies can't absorb that cost or have to pass that along to their consumers, especially small and middle-sized retailers who don't have the flexibility to move their supply chain. So right now, again, we've got several announcements being made. We've only got one set of tariffs that really have taken effect. That's the 10% tariffs on China over the immigration and fentanyl related issues.
Mm-hmm. Right.
But we've got, Canadian and Mexican tariffs that are on pause right now. Hopefully they can come to an agreement by March 4. If not, the tariffs either take effect or get delayed once again. We've got the steel and aluminum tariffs that were announced last week that go into effect in March. Some are further delayed because you got to figure out what component, what percentage of steel and aluminum are in the product and try to put a tariff on that.
Right.
We've got the reciprocal tariff announcement that came out last week. That's more of a plan to put reciprocal tariffs in place. We've got the president talking about auto tariffs and solar tariffs and pharmaceutical tariffs and tariffs on the EU. So again, lots of uncertainty that retailers are trying to figure out. Again, what the ultimate impact is going to be and what the impact on the consumer is going to be as well. And you're starting to see consumer sentiment, shifting downwards.
Yeah, well,
The last, I guess University of Michigan study that came out showed, consumers are getting concerned because, they're not seeing price decreases like the president had promised and what the president had run. So, consumers are starting to get fearful of the impact of tariffs and the potential increases they're going to see.
yeah, I mean, it's interesting. And when I think about it, I think of, I'll just take the automobile one that potentially might be starting at 25%, could go higher. But if I think about the American family and I think about, a car is typically what's called discretionary, right? Discretionary money. But, you need a car to work and you need a car to, get out there. So, how are families going to afford this? What's going to happen is it goes back to your point about, that big spending pool gets, shrunken down and, people are going to have less discretionary spending to spend on other things. You need a car. Do you really need a vacation? One would argue, yes, you need a vacation for your mental well-being, but, you have to earn a living, right? So I don't know. It's really interesting about that whole scenario with, how much consumers are going to actually end up paying and how that's going to impact their daily life.
No, absolutely. Obviously, it's going to depend upon the retailer and the product and the category as to how that all has the impact. Let's just take the Mexico tariffs as an example. One of the biggest categories that's going to be impacted are imports of fresh fruits and produce. Avocados, number one item imported from Mexico. Other products as well, because it's, very seasonal with vegetables that aren't grown in the U.S., throughout the year. So that certainly has an impact. And, not only you're going to see, price increases, but if consumers cut back on their spending, you'll see less variety and less options for consumers as well. So, as much as folks would love to move supply chains back to the U.S., you just can't move everything back here. It's just not feasible to do that. We can't make everything here it's just not possible. 95% of the world's consumers live outside the United States. So the other part of the discussion here is not just on the impact on the tariffs on the import side, but it's the retaliation that our manufacturers and ag exporters face, and retailers as well, because sometimes, retail gets caught up in those retaliatory tariffs, especially luxury goods, when you talk about, potential tariffs on the EU. So there's a wide spectrum of impacts that are going to happen with tariffs, despite what you hear from, key administration officials who say, the prices didn't increase. We didn't have inflation last go around. That's not accurate. We actually did. We saw price increases.
Yeah.
We were in a better position back in 2018 because of the success of the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, which reduced the tax rate for retail from 35 to 21%. So retailers had more flexibility to adjust to some of these tariffs. We don't have that ability now. We're in a very, very different economy than we were, back during the first Trump administration.
Right. And John, I want to go back to something you said earlier, because the other side of the argument is many people believe that with these tariff on all these products, that we are going to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. And that is going to be great for America. But I kind of heard you say that may not be the case. What's your kind of position on, do you really believe that a lot, maybe not so much, how much manufacturing can actually come back to the United States?
Look, I think when we talk about tariffs from the NRF perspective, we think tariffs are an important tool in the toolbox when we talk about trade discrepancy. But they need to be targeted. They need to be strategic on what we're going after. Going after consumer goods, everyday household items, doesn't make sense to us. Let's be more strategic and focus on the right categories that should come back to the United States. Defense, industrial, those, high-end manufacturing, those kinds of areas, not everyday consumer goods that just haven't been made here in decades, like toys. We don't make toys here in the United States anymore. We're not set up to be able to do that. And as far as, why we can't make everything here, I mean, let's just take a look at what happened with baby formula during the pandemic and kind of post-pandemic, where 97% of all baby formula that's sold here in the United States is made here in the United States. We had one factory that went down because of health-related issues that was offline for 6 months or so. And
Yeah.
we had a crisis. We could not produce enough baby formula to satisfy the market needs. How do we rectify that? What was the solution that we put in place? We lowered tariffs on European baby formula and allowed the import of baby formula from Europe to help make up that need for the market. Once the crisis was over, the tariffs went back up, but that's how we solved that crisis, and shows how we can't just make everything here. Unfortunately, we need to rely on the global supply chain for the availability of stuff that's just not made here. So again, let's focus on the strategic areas that we should really focus on to be made here. But again, it's not just putting tariffs on to bring manufacturing back. We've got to focus on the labor. Where are we going to get the skilled labor from?
Right.
How quickly are we getting manufacturing facilities up and running? And oh, by the way, if we're going to be building new factories, guess what goes into those factories? Steel and aluminum that now have a 25% tariff on them.
Right.
So you're making the cost of manufacturing, of building the factories more expensive than what it originally was. So we've really got to take a look at, wholesale. What are we trying to achieve? What is the point of the tariffs? When you talk to the administration officials, they talk about, 4 different reasons for why they want tariffs. It's a negotiating tactic to get countries to come to the table and talk about and resolve trade discrepancies. Okay, but we can do that without putting tariffs in place. I mean, that's why you have, free trade negotiations, and you have negotiate with countries to address some of those issues. We'd welcome that opportunity to open up export markets and provide other opportunities for retail, but on the import side as well. They use tariffs as a way to get companies to shift out of China and, divest away from China. We've seen that. You saw that back in 2018 with the Section 301 tariffs. You saw a number of folks try to move out of China. A lot of that went to Southeast Asia and elsewhere, but didn't really come back here to the United States for a variety of reasons. But we all know it's not easy to shift your supply chain. It takes months, if not years, to kind of really establish that.
Definitely.
Number 3, it's a tool to bring manufacturing back to the U.S. Again, it's one tool. We've got to focus on the other policies that help bring that manufacturing back here. Focus on jobs. Focus on getting the red tape out of the way to build factories and all those other pieces. And then number 4 is the other piece that people talk about, is that it's a revenue raiser. So it helps pay for things like tax reform and everything else that the president wants to achieve. Look, we want the president to succeed. We want him to get the tax bill done, but not on the backs of consumers and consumer goods paying for it. So, there's a lot of discussion of how, again, the president likes to go back to, 1913 when tariffs were the main source of revenue for the government. We're not in that kind of environment anymore. We can't tariff ourselves enough to replace the income tax or make up for that income.
Right. I think the other thing, just in the retail industry, is there's this air of uncertainty that has really kind of plagued us for many years. And I know a lot of retailers and brands are being very cautious, but these everyday tariff announcements and dramatic changes in policy and government, I think it really makes it difficult for retailers to plan with any high degree of effectiveness. And I know we're in unprecedented times, but I feel like I keep saying that, and I've said it every year since 2020. But, how can we navigate through this, retail environment that we're in right now? And maybe based on your expertise on the supply chain side, what should we be doing, thinking about? What kind of strategy should we be implementing?
Yeah, absolutely. The uncertainty is probably the highest levels that I've ever seen. And again, the daily announcements and just not knowing what's going to happen and when makes it very difficult for retailers and others as they're planning their supply chains, because you're typically planning 6, 9, 12 months in advance. And when things just all of a sudden happen that you hadn't planned for, makes it very difficult. I mean, look, the supply chain has faced unbelievable challenges over the past, 5 to 8 years, from, disruptions we saw during the first Trump administration, through COVID, through port strikes and shutting down the Red Sea and, everything else. And so all this goes into the decisions that retailers are making, trying to reset their supply chain. Obviously, looking at how do we diversify away from China is a big part of that, but trying to find new locations where you have the capacity to make up for, what you were making in China. Again, looking at the skilled workforce. Do they have that in country? Do they have the logistics and transportation and infrastructure that you need for those higher volumes that are going to be coming through? How are the roads and bridges and ports? Do they have regular sailings with some of the larger vessels that are coming through? So all of that goes into the decision making you've got to look at to figure out how best can I plan my supply chain, knowing all the different challenges you're facing, whether it's geopolitical, tariff issues or something else. So I think what retailers are trying to do right now is really get a full understanding of the scope of their supply chain and understand where are the risks and where are the opportunities. And it's not just for those who are kind of the direct importers who have more control over their supply chains, but again, for the small and medium-sized guys to look, at their vendors, look at their indirect supply chain and fully understand, what is their exposure to tariffs as well as other potential issues, and find ways to minimize the potential impacts. Are there other opportunities you can take, other countries you can be looking at? So I think, again, getting that full view of your supply chain from start to finish is really where a lot of folks are focusing in right now and trying to see where is the greatest risk and then where's the opportunity to minimize that risk as best as possible.
Yeah, it's such a complex issue, and you're right. It takes years and years to really plan out a sophisticated supply chain with the right infrastructure. So, the other thing before you leave, I have to ask you about, because you and I talked about this when you were on Retail Unwrapped a few months ago, that's de minimis. And so that's the law that companies like Temu and Shein have used to kind of circumvent having to pay taxes on consumer goods. So that was a law was put in place, or they took that away from these retailers. But then there were like 1 million packages that landed at JFK that there was no process in place to mandate the tariffs on all these packages. So then it was taken back, and now it's in pause for a minute. I mean, where are we with de minimis? What's your take on it?
Sure. So, I mean, de minimis has been in existence for decades, and obviously started with the personal traveler and not having to declare small amounts when they were traveling. The law got amended back in 2016 to up the limit for the individual shipments to $800, and obviously there's been a lot of concern over the past 5-6 years throughout the pandemic as e-commerce shipments have kind of exploded under the de minimis entry. I mean, you hear the millions and millions of packages that are coming in from customs, and some of the challenges they have with looking at those. As you noted, when the China tariffs were put in place a couple of weeks ago, the 10% China tariffs, part of what was required under that order was a removal of the use of de minimis for anything subject to the 10%. They also suspended duty drawback for folks as well. So, as you noted, with that suspension of de minimis, they required a formal entry. So, made it more difficult to bring products in under de minimis. You saw the U.S. Postal Service essentially stop mail and parcel delivery for a span of about 12 hours before it got turned back on. Just the deliveries from China. And then within, I think it was a day or two, they came out and amended the order saying that because there was no system in place to collect the duties, they suspended the delay of de minimis until the Department of Commerce can certify a new process to collect the duties. I don't know why it's Commerce has to certify that, since it's Customs and Border Protection who collects the duties, so it should be Treasury. So I think Treasury, Customs, and Commerce and Postal are all working on that process. But as of right now, de minimis is still operating as normal as it was before until they can figure out that effort to collect the duties. But I mean, de minimis is still an issue that this administration and Congress are paying very close attention to and trying to work ways to address some of the ongoing challenges that are there. As a reminder, we still have 2 notice of proposed rulemakings that were put out right before President Trump took office from the prior administration that would require more data on de minimis entries for customs to be able to do their screening, but as well as eliminating the use of de minimis for products that are subject to trade remedies, like the Section 301 tariffs. So those notice of proposed rulemakings are working their way through the process now. I think there's a mid-March deadline for stakeholders to submit comments to customs, and then it'll take them probably a couple months to kind of go through all the comments and come out with a final rule, and then from then on they'll do a final rule. Unclear when that would be implemented, but there's still a lot of tension on de minimis. Congress is looking at different legislation, so at some point there will be changes to de minimis. Just unclear what it will be at this point, but I think we can all guarantee some changes will be made to the system.
Yeah, and it just goes back to the point earlier about this kind of back and forth and these quick policy changes without really process in place to handle the new changes is difficult. It's a difficult environment to operate in, for sure, for many retailers. So any closing thoughts that you have on this very complex issue?
No, I think, look, for folks who are listening in, especially retailers, it's, again, know your supply chain, understand where the risks are, what the impacts are, and be able to kind of work through that. And at NRF, we're here to represent the industry. We're having those conversations, trying to educate folks on the impact of the tariffs. Again, when used in a strategic manner, they make sense. But to have broad-based on everything and everyone is going to have a significant impact on consumers, on businesses who aren't able to reinvest in the bottom line or their people, which we think is incredibly important, especially for the retail sector. So it's, we want to work with the administration as best we can, but we need the examples of, what the tariffs mean and how they're going to impact folks.
Well, thank you, John. It's always a pleasure to have you on, and I want to thank you on behalf of all the retailers for all the work that you do at the NRF to support our retail industry.
Thank you, Shelley. Appreciate it.
And for our listeners, next week we have a fantastic guest coming on, Lindsay Sheftick. She is the marketing guru genius, and it'll be a lively conversation. Always fun to hear her take on what's going on with marketing. So please make sure to join in, and thank you.